if you think about it, I can't talk a whole lot about it, but if you think about it simply as how do you influence people's behaviors, quite frankly, to get them to want to make change.
Hello, listeners! Today, we will be learning tons from Karen Gregory, a seasoned expert in organizational development and change management. So, with over 24 years of military experience and a background in behavioral science, Karen has worked as an influence operations manager in the U.S. Air Force and served as CEO of a government contracting company for 10 years. Now, Karen is helping organizations make the shift from traditional, outdated, and dare I say cringy HR to a more transformative, developmental approach that empowers leaders to build thriving teams. So get ready to be inspired by Karen Gregory. Welcome to our show, Karen.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Janine.
So excited to jump right into the conversation because we don't have that much time and there's so much that we can discuss. So I want to start by saying I'm so sorry that I have this naive view of the military because of all the movies that I've been watching. But it's like, for me, an organization that is kind of set in their ways. So I was really surprised and pleasantly surprised when we first had our conversation and you were so bubbly and so passionate. So could you just tell us a little bit more about your role in the Air Force as an influence operations manager and how you transitioned to working in organizational change and development?
Okay, so I ended up basically the culmination of my career was as an influence operations officer. And so, sort of the buildup, I'll kind of talk to that because I think we'll allude back to it in some of this discussion, kind of why I say the things I say and kind of where I'm coming from. And so I entered the Air Force as a behavior scientist, and one of my first jobs was more aligned with industrial and organizational psychology. And personnel management, actually. And so we did test construction, so developing specialty knowledge tests for our enlisted troops because that's part of their promotion point. So how they get promoted, they could actually test that they know their job. So that's how I started. From there, I did other jobs. I actually was afforded the opportunity to teach at the Air Force Academy. So I became a course director for organizational behavior out there, but I also taught such basically like HR, organizational behavior, and other courses, obviously, as needed out there. And so I taught management 101 even. And so it really got the knowledge and the education and obviously a lot of time on the platform. So they usually say, hey, if you're going to teach others, you better know your stuff. So it was a great opportunity as a young officer to really get to know my stuff. And so really more came from that academic and personnel management background initially. Kind of continued that, honestly, after that assignment. I was afforded an opportunity to become a organizational assessment and development psychologist. And so became a division chief. And what was I doing? Developing climate assessments. And I don't mean the weather kind, I mean the culture kind, right? The kind in the organizations throughout the DoD. So all of our DoD agencies, organizations, whether civilian or military, actually are required to take an annual climate assessment. So it's called the DOX in the DoD. So I was able to help develop that, administer, come up with basically action plans and recommendations for organizations across the globe in the DoD. So that was another just great opportunity to really get to know like all the different types of organizations that were out there and kind of like, in a way, entrepreneurial, right? And sort of intrinsically looking at like, how do we help ourselves? And so almost in a consulting fashion in a sense. So I did that. From there, I was probably about halfway into my career. You mentioned the 24 years. And so I came about halfway and I thought, okay, to make it the other half, because I was aiming for the 20 years, I thought, okay, I got to go more operational. And so that's how I got into the influence operations and information operations background. And so if you think about it, I can't talk a whole lot about it, but if you think about it simply as how do you influence people's behaviors, quite frankly, to get them to want to make change. And I'll give a quick example that I can give, but that's basically what influence operations is. Obviously, we could use this in other types of activities. Those would be activities that I can't talk about, but where I can talk about is training our own what we call blue folks. And so our Air Force, we would call them blue, right? And so if you think about how do you influence an Air Force operator's behavior? So say they're doing something that maybe tends to lend to sharing information that maybe we don't want to share openly, just put it out there. So what we would do is training, right? So we would do some of that covertly, and then we would share it overtly to just say, hey, these were some of our findings. So if you think about it, almost like an evaluation of like, hey, let's just go out there, figure out what's going on or what's not going on, and then be able to come back and train our own folks on, hey, these are some of the things that we noticed. These are some of the areas that we might want to tighten up on. Again, just trying to influence them, and their behaviors, to change the behaviors so that we don't make ourselves susceptible, quite frankly, to an adversary. And so that was more the operational context. So you can see like sort of all building
Yeah.
blocks.
No, I was gonna
Really
say
all about
your
influencing.
your career is like full circle. Like you start, okay, like I enter, okay, I know behavioral science, and then you get to teach, which is kind of a self-reflection, right? Of like, okay, how do I communicate this and get this message across, and understand the concept in a different level because you have to teach them. And I find that when you have to teach or present something, it's always different. Like you get to know it in a deeper level, and then you get to like assess and compare different organizational cultures until you end up influencing and motivating people. That's so cool.
Yeah.
Okay, like we have a lot that we can learn from you,
That is the
from
building
all.
block, though.
Yeah. But like with all your experience, what would be like your top lesson that you took from the Air Force and working in the Air Force to what you do now in organizational development?
Yeah, I think this is probably a lesson that's not even necessarily specific to what I do, like in the HR world or even organizational development. I think it's just good leadership practice. And I was always taught, like, basically, delegate and move out of the way, right? That's a great way to build other leaders. And so for me, and when you think about change, we've got to trust people. We've got to be able to hand things over and know that the rest of our folks, our team members, can help us get where we need to be. I won't spend a lot of time with trust because we could spend an hour or two or three
Yeah.
on trust alone, right? And why that's such a core fundamental thing that organizations and teams need to have. But I would say, yeah, delegate. Leaders delegate. Trust your folks, and if you're not sure if they can, then get them the training or help provide OGT, whatever it is, to get them where they need to be. Then delegate those tasks, those activities, and move out the way, because it's like compounding effect. It's not just me. Now if I've got 10 people working with me, because I never say for me, we are a team. It
Yeah.
is my job to allow them the opportunity to grow and develop, and we do that by moving out of the way.
I love that. Trust, delegate, and move out of the way. Now let's go to the meat of the conversation and what we really wanna like dig into, which is that shift from a traditional administrative HR to organizational development. Um, can you tell us before we dive into that discussion, like why are you so passionate about this? Like you mentioned, it's like a movement. You want to convert people to get into this. So why are you so passionate about this shift in mindset?
I think for me, it's because it's just taking a different viewpoint. And so when we think about HR, we automatically think people, right? And so I think, from an organizational development perspective, we're really looking at the organization, not just the people, that's a component of, but the entire organization as a whole. So it could be the people, it could be the processes, it could even be things like facilities, for example, hot desking, which we know we've had to, we're sort of getting back into the hoteling, hot desking, we call it hot desking in the military, sharing and the remote work situation, right? And so it looks at all those things. But in the end, who does the work, generally speaking? Not always, because we have a lot of AI and other things that are coming into play now. But people are the core of making a mission work or not, right? Successfully. And so I say, OD is a generally is more of a strategic perspective, looking at the organization as a whole to include the people, whereas HR is looking at just the people. And I'll add, I've been in this space for a long time, and I would say easily 3 decades now, we've said, and I'm sure you've heard it, HR has to be more strategic. And I remember there was a whole big push, 20 years ago, how does HR people get a seat at the table and things like that? This is how. Understand that this is a strategy. HR is a piece of that. And what is the strategy is to look at it under the organizational development lens.
It's funny you mentioned that. Our some members of our team at Erudite just went to the event Unleashed in Vegas, and one of their key like learnings, their takeaways that they're so excited about is that the HR industry, they're thinking that COVID gave HR a seat at the leadership table, and they don't want to give that up. Like finally,
They should.
organizations are taking notice and listening to what they have to say, and they do not want to give up that power and influence.
And HR,
But
HR is critical. They are all about the people piece of it. And we cannot be successful as organizations without the people. So,
but in our first conversation, I recall vividly you saying, well, like sometimes people cringe with the term HR. So can you like clarify what do you as traditional, more cringy HR and versus like organizational development, and what's that shift supposed to look like?
right. So I don't cringe with HR. Let me just clarify for folks like,
I
wait a
can't.
minute. I am a proponent for an organizational development perspective. HR is so critical. And I do think, sort of that traditional, like, I've taught many times, and folks would come to me after, be like, "Oh my gosh, you presented this and this HR stuff in such a different way that I wasn't like, oh, I don't want to listen to this,"
Yeah.
And so I think we've got to get away from that stigma. Those of us in the people business need to get away from that stigma, and that goes back to taking more of a strategic perspective, because I think traditionally HR, if you look at it outside in, you just look at it, and I think of it like the HR life cycle. So we think of things like recruiting and hiring and performance management, sort of those traditional HR functions. Unfortunately, performance management, part of it is the disciplinary thing, right? Or the
Right.
rules that people don't want to always abide by or don't like. So that's why you get that like, HR, I got to deal with the old stovepiping HR. And so, again, 20, 30 years ago, we were talking like HR needs to think more strategic. It's not just thinking, we need leaders. And I think we're going to talk about that. Hopefully, we make it to that. Leaders need to change their mindset and how they see HR to give them the opportunity to prepare things, present things in a more strategic manner. And so I think, again, it's just been looking at it as sort of this traditional, we're doing a lot of talking about how it should look. And some organizations are making that shift to more of a strategic
You touch
perspective.
on this already. You mentioned like the leaders. Is that the first step in making this change? Like what if we're to do okay, everyone do this first step just so we can move towards the future of HR, what is that step?
The first step is definitely having our leaders, and I'm not even say get on board, because usually I'd be like, we need our leaders on board, but I would say embracing, living, eating, breathing, living, change. They need to be the example of the change. I've seen in many organizations, in my consulting work and history, that we talk a lot about we need this, we need that, but it points the finger at everybody else in the organization. And I am hard on leaders because ultimately they are a big maker or breaker. We can't do it without the people, the masses, but the leaders are the ones that set the tone. They're the one that says basically to everybody else through their behaviors more than anything of what is acceptable and what is not. What does change look like? And so first and foremost, yeah, leaders need to be exuding what that change looks like, be involved, roll up their sleeves, show what it looks like, right? Be actually involved in the change, not just saying, oh, yes, we need a change and they're the ones going to make things happen.
But these days it's like remote working, hybrid office. Like in the past I feel like I'd see the leaders, I'd see the bosses, and be like, okay, like it's easier for them to influence the rest of the organization. How has that changed now that we're shifting to remote?
So I will say, I actually gave this some thought. So I think leaders who, let me just say it this way, leaders who lead well do it
Hmm.
well no matter the work environment.
They'll find
Remote,
a way.
yep, they will find a way. Because I could tell you, my experience has been that the good leaders, and I'll give an example because I know sometimes that's a little bit more, people can kind of get their arms around it. But in my current organization that I work with, we had a senior leader. Sadly, he's not here anymore, but we've got awesome leaders in the organization. But this one specific leader, as we went through change, he was that person literally. And this was in the last 3 years. So it was during COVID, all remote. Plus, we're geographically dispersed all over the world. And so we were already sort of working, at least geographically
Right.
separated. Some are in offices, some are home, some are all over the, who knows where. And so, but this leader specifically, he was really great because he would hold, we'll call them like town halls, but he would hold sessions, even senior leader sort of, we call them sometimes coffee and conversations or ask me anything. We do that quarterly. And so he was excellent at just getting out there and staying connected. Folks, he put it out there, hey, I don't care who you are. If you're looking for somebody to help mentor you, call me, IM me, send me a message on team, whatever. He was in the thick of it, literally rolling up the sleeves, showing what it
Yeah.
looked like and how to be a good leader through change. The organization I work in now, they are and many organizations are like this. That is the change, right? The change is the constant thing. Change, change,
Right.
change. They're constantly pivoting. And so he knew if he were not to keep a pulse on the organization, a pulse on the people, and what's working, what's not. Okay, we're getting some resistance. No, they're on board. How did he do that? He was checking in with them regularly. Sure, we could say that, being in person, you don't have that constant sort of, and I would say some don't anyways, depends where you work in the organization, but you may not get to see that leader, more often. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's not. Again, it depends where you work in the organization. But he was really good about hosting those sessions of no kidding, just sort of transparency, and
Right.
just being real with people. And I remember even one time somebody did ask a question that he was not. We had actually prepared, and we kind of have a sense of what is going on. That's our job. So of what was going on in terms of sort of the climate. And so we had prepped him, so he knew it was going to. Sure enough, if the question didn't get asked, and he basically just responded, "You know what? It's my prerogative to not answer all the questions. Those that I feel comfortable, and I will." And people respected that because they knew he was just an authentic, good example of a true leader. And so it can be done, but it's got to be purposeful and deliberate. It can't be an afterthought.
Right. And people can get creative about it. Like they're like, okay,
Mhm.
maybe now town hall. I mean, who knows what tools and innovative things people are
Yeah.
gonna come up with to
I mean, we've done
regularly check.
social hours. I mean, I'm sure you've seen a lot of this in the last 2 or 3 years. Do something. I guess that's the short of it. Do
Right.
something. Let's not blame COVID or remote work, because now I'm starting to see the pendulum swing the other way. It's like, oh, is remote work or telework becoming a problem and creating a negative culture? Well, only if you let it. So, which
Right.
means usually because you've left people out on the island and we're not checking in and we're not being deliberate and purposeful about connecting. Sure, virtual
Right.
is not the same. We know that. But it's the next best thing. And we won't go down this rabbit trail, but when we talk about retention, this is a way to one, attract the best because you can find them from anywhere, and then two, retain the best potentially because
Right.
there are some workplace flexibilities. So, but every organization is different. It's not a cookie cutter.
It's true. But what is similar in all organizations, I think, is that people appreciate the effort, right? They appreciate the effort of leadership when they see that, okay, there's an effort to get to know like how we're doing and to support us. Like that is always
Mhm.
appreciated. And we move towards empowering leaders now. When we were doing our back and forth for the guide questions, just for our listeners to know, I was like, asking questions more about leadership development. And you're like making that distinction of what's organizational development and what leadership development is. So for those like me who aren't so aware, can you give us kind of like a little description of each?
So I would say, we kind of tied it in already, right? To say, first of all, even to think about, making some of these changes, got to have leaders on board, and leader development. I mean, even education is so critical to change management, honestly, because organizational development is really about that. It's about how do we improve the organization? Some of it being people, some of it being processes, some of it be work design. There's all kinds of things that would fall in OD, in organizational development. And now leadership development is really, and I'm going to call it leadership education and development, because sometimes we still have leaders that aren't aware of what organizational development is and how they could really leverage that to improve their organization overall. And so there is a difference. It's and I think I shared this with you when we talked initially, is I kind of look at things, and I am a bit disruptive. That's sort of what I do, turn things on their head. Like in traditional mindset, we go like, okay, we've got HR, we've got leaders, right? And we've talked already about like, do they all sit at the same table? Things like that. But I said, let's flip it on its head, right? And look at it from a very strategic. Leaders need to be on board. So let's educate them on what OD can do for them, because HR is a component of that. And then our HR practitioners or HR leaders, again, look at it from a strategic lens, from that OD, organizational development lens, not just the transactional things like, payroll, very important. Benefits, important. We need those sort of tactical, military term, right? Tactical level things, or we're going to have a mutiny, which is going to be a different issue. Those are important, but they're very tactical. And so definitely different. I look at it as OD, like I was saying, turn on his head, OD being kind of sort of the top of the pyramid, and everything else flow down. You develop your leaders, you develop your employees. Well, somebody would say, well, that's HR. It's more the strategy, the action plan for doing it. The execution would be HR or your training team, or however you have your organization aligned.
Got it. Thank you so much. We touch on leaders and how important they are to make sure that you're developing and changing your organization the way you want to. So I guess now one of the roles of HR will be to spot the leaders, like the influencers within the organization. So how can they spot the leader, and how can they continue developing their skills and abilities?
Yeah, I think organizations are doing this differently. But, when I was reviewing the questions, I thought, what happened to like the apprentice program? Let's go back even before my time, because I haven't seen that. It's usually more of a technical kind of thing. But I thought, well, why not? And so, because I look at it from the perspective, I've worked a lot, and primarily actually with STEM related organizations in my military career, in the consulting company, all of that, we really focused on STEM. And when I look at that, what I would see a lot of times happen is we'd find, and I'm just going to use this as an example, not always the case, but for example, an engineer. And they go, this person is a great engineer. Let's promote them. And I'm not going to say that supervising, managing, and leadership are synonymous. They are not in my mind. And so it could be one, but not all. But what we would see happen is that you take an engineer who is a really good, technical SME, right, an engineer, and promote them into a leadership type role, whether it be, again, supervisor, manager, something like that. And then realize down the road, like, oh, maybe they would have been better as, the engineering subject matter expert, given whatever title, but not necessarily a supervisor or management in that type of a leadership role. And so I think, again, it kind of, there's a whole debate of like, is leadership sort of innate and you come with certain people are just really good leaders to begin with, or is it something you could develop? I believe it can be developed where there is a want to be developed. And so I think for there are some really natural leaders out there, really good natural leaders out there, but I think there's also plenty that, we're looking to continue to focus on and further developing. Even those that are great, they recognize like there's no pinnacle. We continue to pivot as individuals, and hopefully organizations. I can't say that hey, use this program. It's going to, develop the best leaders. I think the biggest thing is like who has, who can balance sort of the get the work done, sort of that operational kind of lead the operations, the mission, right, which takes some of the people based skill sets like empathy and like transparency to actually come across as authentic, which then full feeds into the other, right, the operational side of the house. So I know that's sort of a nebulous answer. It doesn't really give the, hey, do this, or they do, the leaders, or the organizations that do it really well do this. I think it depends on every organization. What I am saying is to caution folks from promoting folks that are really good with technical expertise into leadership roles where they need 60% of their skill base needs to be more on the people skills, and maybe not be the technical SME instead.
And it takes time, like, supervising a team, supporting your team, making sure they have what they need, like that takes up a lot of time and energy, that if it's someone that's so great and like an expert at a specific thing, it will eat away from that. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
I mean, and that's a true challenge. I could say, for the organization that I work in right now, it is a true challenge. And I'm going to strictly like hone into supervisors specifically in that leadership role, because they, many of them are, we'll just say, operational subject matter experts. And so they're promoted. Now they're supervisors, and a percentage of their time is supposed to be spent supervising for the reasons you just said, right? Like it takes time to do like administrative that nobody maybe wants to do, but you have to do it, to actually spend time talking with your folks, helping to develop them, giving guidance, whatever. And so it is a challenge to juggle the demands of being a supervisor and still having some operational component that you're responsible for.
So, based on your experience, like, how do you see the future of leadership? Like, do you think there's going to be a split in that, okay, like people that are stronger or have the strength of like empathy and just being able to support people and communicate in a way that, inspires people, versus the more technical type
Right.
leadership, more operational?
I would love to say that I wish it would go that way. I think the reality is that the organizations that recognize, those effective, I'm not going to say good because define good, right? But those effective leaders are going to continue to, pour into that. I think, in my ideal fantasy world, it would be for organizations to recognize that not everybody is meant to be in a leadership role. I mean, there's other ways like, hey, for career development. And this is what I share with a lot of in the past with clients, and even now where I work, but even me and my husband at the dinner table talk about this for his organization, because he is an engineer. And so where does he go if he, and some folks want to stay in the technical, they don't want to supervise people. And
Right.
so again, sort of changing the mindset. And this is where organizational development specialists can help, because again, it's really about change and improvement for the organization. So somebody like myself, who is an OD specialist, will look at this and go, okay, well, how do we get from here to where, so define where you want to get. And so if you need however many leaders, which in my case right now is they're either defined as a supervisor or a manager, generally speaking, then how do we create those? Well, then we need to balance out, because we do need them to have that operational background. You can't lead a team when you have no idea what they're doing, right? Because you don't have a background in that technical area. But we also need to give them the space to be good supervisors and managers. And I feel currently what I see a lot of is there's just a lack of bandwidth to do that, because we get pulled back into that operational, like, well, the mission's got to happen and we've got to get it done. Well, part of the mission is making sure your people are taken care of and they're equipped to get the mission done. And so I think when organizations truly commit to that, goes back to what we said, leaders, educated and trained and developed, because they are first and foremost, they're the ones that can be the difference makers in what is going to happen in the organization or not. and they lead by example. And so if they're exuding that same type of development and space, if you will, to do sort of both, to be enabled to do both, I think that's where we'll see the difference. I have hope for that. There are some that are doing that very well, and is always room for improvement in some others. And so, but I think that definitely will pay dividends in the long game.
Nice. I got so many like insights and like a change in the way I thought of like success and leadership, right? Because now it's like, oh, like for you to succeed in a company, for you to grow, you got to be a leader. But not necessarily. It doesn't equate to success being a leader. Maybe you're better, I don't know, like being there, a subject matter expert in something that everyone just goes to when they need information, you know.
Yeah.
So
Well,
yeah, thank
and
you for
Janine,
that.
I'd posit like, what is the definition of a leader? We're really talking about positions, right? Career
Right.
development. We're talking, we want to sort of move up the ladder to certain positions.
Mm-hmm.
You can be a leader as a subject matter expert. It's just an informal leader because you do not have that supervisory or management, term, if you will. In other words, you're not accountable necessarily for other folks because usually that's what we see, obviously, with supervisors and managers. But anybody in an organization can be a leader. Do you have influence? You mentioned influence, and not just for my job, but basically that's what leadership is about: influence. And I think anyone in an organization can be an influencer if they choose to be. And so I think that's right there the difference, because currently in my role, I have no subordinates. I am a subject matter expert. And so I lead from that, right? Because I know my stuff. And so it does
You
not
do.
mean, it's just a different role, but it's something to be
Right.
looked, to look to move up to, right? Because now I am that subject matter expert for my organization. And quite frankly, in some cases, don't tell anybody, but it's easier because all I have to worry about is me and doing a good job, right? And it just goes back to like, okay, balance like your job, what you've got to actually do, and balancing the supervising component, right, of the people. And
Right.
so now my 100% my focus is just knocking it out on the park on organizational development, that's what I do. So again, so I love it that you said that and you recognize that, when you think of, kind of going up the ladder, so to speak, what else can you look for? It's not necessarily the old school, again, mentality of like, what's a
Right.
leadership position? Oh, I need to supervise people. No, how about be a subject matter expert? And I think, I am going to be very pointed about the STEM related organizations because I think they need to do that a lot more often, have SMEs
I
as
agree.
leads, almost like team leads, the guru, the go to, whatever you
Right.
want to call them, and then have other folks who have either been developed or naturally inclined to lead in the soft skills or in the people. Because I say soft skills are not soft skills, those are usually the hard skills, actually, but actually, supervise and manage the people.
Awesome. Yeah, and celebrate it, right? And
Yeah,
appreciate all of it, like all the different types of leaders in the organization.
exactly.
Great,
Well, just think
Karen.
how
Thank
many
you
more
so
roles
much. Like honestly, it
we
was
could
such a good
create.
like
That would be
ending.
exciting because we wouldn't pigeonhole folks, one way, like you got to be this or you weren't successful. No, that's not true. I feel very successful. I'm a subject matter expert. That's success.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it is something to be celebrated, definitely. I'm super excited we got together today.
Yeah, me too. Again, thank you so much for sharing your stuff and sharing your incredible insights and experiences with us today. For our listeners, I highly encourage you to connect with Karen on LinkedIn because she's like super friendly and you can message her and like continue the conversation with her. It's really a lot of fun talking to her. And you can learn more about her work and tap into her enthusiasm that's gonna feed your energy as well. So thank you again, Karen. We've only scratched the surface, so I hope we can connect again for another episode. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Janine.